And now, from the University of Virginia Center for Politics.
Good evening to everyone, and welcome to another very special event, one that I've been looking forward to because it features a congressman that I've been following since he's been in Congress. He's in his third term right now, and he's making a difference. And that means a great deal to the country. It means a great deal certainly to his district and to the issues that he has been putting his emphasis on, including one that's focused in his book, which we'll get to in just a moment. Representative Khanna, I think you can all see him here. He's outside the Capitol because this relates to a book of his. And so we have to obey all the rules. And not a lot of congressmen do, Congressman Khanna, but I'm glad that you do. We're obeying all the rules here. He represents California's 17th congressional district, and this is the very heart of Silicon Valley. So it's a very important and special district. And as I mentioned, he's serving his third term. He sits on the House committees on agriculture, armed services, oversight and reform, and he chairs the environmental subcommittee of that committee as well. That ought to keep you busy, all those committees there, Congressman. Additionally, Representative Khanna is the deputy whip of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. He serves as an assistant whip for the Democratic Caucus, and he's the Democratic vice chair of the House Caucus on India and Indian Americans. I don't know how you do all that, but you're young, you're vigorous, and you're going places, and that's what's important. Both of the congressman's parents, I found this very interesting. They immigrated to the United States in the 1970s from India in search of opportunity and a better life for their children. His father is a chemical engineer. His mother is a substitute school teacher, near and dear to my heart. The congressman's commitment to public service was inspired by his grandfather, who was active in Mahatma Gandhi's independence movement. My goodness, to have a direct connection to Gandhi is remarkable. Prior to serving in Congress, Representative Khanna taught economics at Stanford University, law at Santa Clara University, and American jurisprudence at San Francisco State University. Did they not give you tenure? Is that why you moved around?
Tenure is harder to get tenure than to get into Congress.
Yeah, right. Well, that says more about us than it does about Congress. Anyway, Representative Khanna served in President Barack Obama's administration as Deputy Assistant Secretary at the U.S. Department of Commerce. He graduated with a BA in economics from the University of Chicago, and he received a law degree from Yale University. I've heard of that one. That law school, I believe, is second to the University of Virginia Law School. So it's way up there. I think you can be very proud of that.
It didn't produce Bobby Kennedy, so you've got
right. That's right. He produced Bobby Kennedy, and the Kennedys used to be here a lot. Anyway, he and his wife, Ritu, reside in Fremont, California. Now, here's why he's here. This is what's really important. It's his new book, which I've seen everywhere, by the way. I mean, people are talking about it. It's doing very well. You've got an incredible media schedule. This clearly is the peak of your media coverage here from the Center for Politics. Just a smaller audience, tiny little bit smaller than some of the network shows you're on. But the book is called Dignity in a Digital Age, Making Tech Work for All of Us. Dignity in a Digital Age. Go right now to any of the book services or your independent bookseller in your community and make sure you get this book, because I've enjoyed it enormously and I've learned a lot. And I'm going to learn more tonight. Also joining us, Congressman, is Christopher Krebs, and he texted me just a few minutes ago that he was in a traffic jam in Boston. But the good news was his driver was breaking all the speed limits and traffic laws. So I hope no policemen are watching this, Chris. But Chris is here to help with the questions. He is, of course, a University of Virginia alum. He's a former student of mine, I'm happy to say, and current resident scholar at the Center for Politics. Congressman, I'm sure you remember that Chris Krebs was head of CISA in the Homeland Security Department and did a wonderful job, fantastic job, keeping the 2020 election safe and secure. and for having the temerity to tell the truth that it was a safe and secure election. He was fired on Twitter by our favorite former president, and I do put the emphasis on former president, Donald Trump. But we're happy to have Chris here. He knows a great deal about this subject too. So let's get right into this. And Congressman, let me start by asking you a simple but important question. In a paragraph, tell the people watching this show right now why your book is important, what you're trying to tell people, and how you want to change the system. It can be 2 paragraphs, since I asked 3 questions, maybe 3 paragraphs. Do what you want to do.
Well, Professor Sabato, if I may call you Larry for this, and please call me Ro. I am honored, first of all, to be here at the Center of Politics. I'm not going to embarrass you by going in at length about an anecdote I've shared over Twitter, but when I had just graduated,
please do.
Well, when I just graduated law school, and this was pre-Obama's age, pre-Obama, I think it was 2002, I had emailed Professor Sabato. He's, of course, written many of these books, and he's well-known. I knew he is still the pundit of American politics, and here is someone ambitious. And I don't think, for young people watching, I don't think you should have any apology for ambition. Lincoln, they used to say, that ambition that knew no rest. It's where ambition should go. And I was out in the Valley, and I emailed him. I said, I'm Indian American. I'm thinking of possibly getting involved in politics. There was a staff person, I won't say for who said, you never get elected to anything, but maybe one day you should go work on the Hill because you'd have a shot of rising up the congressional ladder, and there are great jobs on the Hill, nothing to discount it. So I emailed Larry. I said, what do you think? Hindu faith, Indian American. And he said, he quoted the Dylan song, "The times are changing, go for it, get involved in the party. As always, people who are involved in the party have a good shot." And he may not remember the exchange at the time, but I'll tell you, it's always told me the value of lifting up new voices, and you never know what you say, the impact that can have. So thank you, Larry, for doing that almost 20 years ago.
I'm glad I gave you the right answer. Believe me, I'm glad I gave you the right answer, because you're doing great work.
Well, let me now get into the thesis of the book. $11 trillion a market cap, $11 trillion in my district and the surrounding area. Apple, Google, Intel, Yahoo, LinkedIn, Cisco, Tesla. And it's gone up 40% during the pandemic. This is probably the most wealth generated in human history in any one place. 25 million digital jobs by 2025. That's more than construction and manufacturing combined, to give a sense of perspective. And yet, for so many Americans, the new economy has not worked. It's meant deindustrialization. It's meant job loss. It's meant the brain drain. My parents used to talk about the brain drain in India. Now I've gone to rural communities, and they talk about a brain drain, that they're afraid their kids aren't going to come back home, that their kids have to leave to get a job. There's nothing wrong with leaving in ambition. I left Bucks County, Pennsylvania for California, but you shouldn't be forced to leave your hometown to have prosperity in a modern economy. And the thesis of this book is that we've got to decentralize economic opportunities in the modern economy so that people can prosper in their communities, so that you can have the revitalization of communities instead of the drift that we've seen of the concentration of wealth in a few big cities. And that if we do that, that we may be able to have more network prosperity, that when Silicon Valley does well, maybe Youngstown, Ohio, or Columbia, South Carolina are doing well. We may be able to have more joint work. We may not have the same cultural fault lines, that people can live in their hometown and have that way of life and not fear cultural displacement, but have the promise of new jobs. And the final subtext is, this is not saying that coal miners need to become coders. I mean, that's been awfully caricatured. It's absolutely not the correct vision. Think of Intel going to Ohio. Think of the new technology jobs being manufacturing jobs, retail jobs, jobs that people in the Midwest, the South are very good at, have excelled at as technicians. And it's just saying we need to get some of the new technology to help them be productive and do this work in a 21st century economy. If Michigan is going to produce computers on wheels, which are the new automobiles, all those technical jobs shouldn't be in Silicon Valley. A lot of them should be in Michigan. And that is the thesis of the book and a roadmap for how we may be able to do that.
That's a wonderful summary, an executive summary, but how do you do that? How is it going to happen? It's important. We've got to do it, but how?
So the book is a conversation starter in this, and I look forward to everyone's ideas. I certainly don't think that I have the panacea, but let me give you a few examples. One, on a good news front, the House just passed the Competes Act. The Senate just passed a few months ago the Innovation and Competition Act. This is a concrete step in getting America to produce again in new technologies and to do it across the country. It has something called the CHIPS Act, which is going to unleash about $52 billion of grants to companies to be able to set up manufacturing in the United States, in the Midwest, in the South. And if you talk to the Intel CEO, Pat Gelsinger, he'll tell you that just the anticipation of that was one of the reasons he was able to convince his board, let's invest in Ohio for the new semiconductor manufacturing. Let's make sure, and he talks about it as a new nationalism, an enthusiasm, a revitalization. And he has to be able to go to the board and say, look, other countries are giving us X, Y, and Z. What is America doing? And now he can say they're going to be matching us in grants, and this is competitive. One small point here, Larry, we didn't invent the jet engine and we didn't invent all of the automobile, but we excelled because we did the mass production. The irony is we invented the semiconductor chip and we've let Taiwan and others do the mass production. We ought to be investing in some of the mass production. And that's what the Innovation and Competition Act says. It says, yes, let's have Van Hauer Bush's vision of pure science, but let's also create a tech directorate at the NSF and look at the commercialization. Let's create tech hubs and look at the production in America and make sure that these jobs are going to refuel manufacturing and actually be part of the production in this country. So that's one theme that can help in this vision.
Was it just low labor costs that exist in some of these other countries that pushed the companies to allow the manufacture to take place there rather than here? Is that the fundamental?
Labor costs was one piece of the story, but I think it's more than that. Partly, I think we were too indifferent. We had this view of globalization. We'll do all the quote unquote knowledge work. We'll do the prototype manufacturing, and it doesn't matter where the production happens. And let's just the market decide. And a lot of jobs, I think, left, and that has really had a hard impact on communities. It was all consumer price above all else. And of course, consumer welfare matters, but we also have to look at a nation having resilient supply chains and having communities with productive jobs and having productive capacity here. So I would say it was a policy mistake that both parties made. Second, other countries gave incentives. And for the longest time, we had this aversion to quote unquote industrial policy. The government can't intervene. Let just the markets do it. And so where would you go? If the late Andy Grove used to say they used to roll out the red carpet in Malaysia when he used to want to set up a plant. He couldn't get a call return from our Commerce Department if he wanted to do anything here. They didn't even care. And so now we're seeing that you can give it strategic incentives and have partnerships with the private sector. And that doesn't mean that you have to have state-owned enterprises like China, which is awful. You don't have to have an ownership in these companies, but you can have partnerships with them. So I would say that both the overseas incentives and sort of a total lack of our concern is partly what led to this flight.
Do you really think the pandemic in some ways is encouraging these corporations to think about producing more here in the United States, in addition to the enormous sums of money you say they've made, and I believe you, over the course of the pandemic? Is that having an impact? Is there a little guilt feeling there? Can we hope?
Well, it's having an impact in certainly they're recognizing that all the talent and all the jobs don't have to be in Silicon Valley, and not everyone has to move to Sand Hill Road. The remote work did that. In fact, one of the venture capitalists critiqued my book a friend. He said, Ro, well, everything you talk about, we're already doing. I said, really? You've gone from 5 years ago where you said you thought all my ideas were crazy and we never decentralized it, to now saying it's all happening. And but that's good news that they are now funding companies in other parts of the country. They're hiring people in other parts of the country. They don't think that everything has to be located in the Bay Area. I don't think it's yet there's a sufficient recognition, though, about that we need to be a nation of producers, that we have to have not just the invention, but the production. But here, I think there's actually opportunity for the government to get involved. I'm working with Senator Rubio on a bill that would have the Federal Financing Bank fund the government, private partnerships to set up factories. So you could have President Biden go to Lordstown, Ohio, stand there with the GM CEO and say, look, for creating electric SUVs, we're going to open up a new factory here in a factory that's closed, and the government is going to be a partner on it. And the interesting thing is you now have Republicans open to that approach as well. And I think you'd have private companies open to that, but it's going to need government policy to nudge that along.
You just mentioned Senator Rubio. And of course, it used to be that policies like the ones you're discussing would be very bipartisan, sometimes virtually unanimous if people were convinced that they were good policies and would produce for their states and districts. It's so difficult to get any real bipartisanship. To the extent that you know, how widespread do you think the bipartisan support would be for these ideas? Is it just Rubio and a few others, or would it be more broad-based?
I think you could have it more broad-based, as the Innovation and Competition Act suggests. I mean, and Senator McConnell vote for that. Challenge is getting attention for the things. The media doesn't cover the Innovation and Competition Act as much. But there is, look, I give Governor DeWine, a Republican, credit in Ohio to attract Intel. And one of the stories I tell in the book is one of the dumbest attacks that Democrats made on Governor Kim Reynolds is we attacked her for not having a college degree. I mean, I can't believe we ran that attack. And actually, she turns out she's one of the most ardent, passionate champions of STEM education. Now, I don't agree with all her policy, but she says, my grandkids need to have these tech jobs. And I worked with her in Jefferson, Iowa on that. And so I think if we focus on what we need to do to make sure America is a nation that produces, a nation that leads China. China's 4 times our size. We need to be probably 4 times its productive capacity to compete in a nation that's going to create jobs and revitalizing this country. We can get bipartisan support for that.
Well, I certainly hope you're right, because we need more bipartisanship. It's easy to say and tough to do, but this seems like an area that is just tailor-made for it. And maybe it can be a wedge to push us in the direction of more bipartisanship in other areas. But let me call Chris Krebs in here, unless he's jumped back in the car. Are you there, Chris? Good. There you go. There you go. He comes in and out on his iPad. By the way, I'm calling you Ro. You're calling me Larry, but he's Mr. Krebs. So I just want to make that very clear. No, I'm kidding.
Congressman, how are you?
Good to see you again.
To you.
Go ahead, Chris. Chris, would you like to ask a question?
No. Go ahead, please.
No, I want you to ask a question. The Congressman's sick of me already. I want you to ask a question.
Yeah, I think one of the issues that I was a pretty staunch advocate of about this time last year is we were talking about the infrastructure bill that for one, we need to bake cybersecurity considerations into any of the technology investments we're making through the infrastructure bill. But more importantly, I think we've got this real interesting opportunity, this window of time in reinvesting in our state and local governments. Having spent the last 4 years of my life dealing with the state and local governments responsible for administering elections and just seeing the sad state of affairs of technology modernization or lack thereof, I think we have a real opportunity right now and in the next several years to help bootstrap and provide not just technological innovation, but also new jobs. So some of that tech transformation and digitalization that would happen. So what, as I look at some of the recent legislation, including potentially funding $50 billion in the CHIPS Act to get out there. What additional avenues do you think there are to help bootstrap our local communities, to help get the right funding into the places where the most the best opportunity for workforce uplift exists?
I couldn't agree with you more. The first point I'd make is, in my experience, having local buy-in, the local private sector, the local community college, the local private college, the local mayor, a pillar of the local community is essential for one of these projects to succeed. Otherwise, you can open the New York Times and you can read about failure after failure of how they tried to create tech innovation in a place and it didn't work. What distinguishes what works from what doesn't is not Silicon Valley involvement or DC involvement. It's the initiative of a local community. Chris Deal in Jefferson, Iowa, he was an all-star USA Today named student, and he was told, you have to leave the town if you want opportunity. I said, no, I'm not. I'm going to come back. And it was his resolve, along with Lynn Kroger, that built that kind of an app academy and partnered with the local community college, Des Moines Community College, and they have all these stakeholders who want that to succeed. So what does the Innovation and Competition Act do? Well, it has 10 of these tech hubs that you have to apply as a community for that funding, and the funding would go to the local school districts and some of the local cities and state and allow for that revitalization and investment. It certainly needs their buy-in. A criticism can be that this is still dealing with such huge sums, and you're not getting enough of the smaller private colleges, community colleges, nonprofit leaders who may need a $500,000 grant and may not have all of the tools to be able to even navigate the federal process to get that. And that should be the focus of future legislation, of how do we get sort of these social entrepreneurs and local state and government leaders to be able to put something together that's not getting Intel there, but is very productive in getting new jobs. And I think that's a fruitful area for new legislation.
Chris, do you have a response?
Yeah, a quick follow-up. So as I think back to the last several years, particularly when you think about the geoeconomic competition that we're in right now with the industries of the future, that competition with China, they've done a really remarkable job of laying out what the strategic sectors where they intend to not just compete but dominate. They've done that principally through the Made in China 2025 plan. They lay out their strategic sectors of advanced IT, agri-sciences, life sciences, automation, and robotics. So there's a massive space they've made a bet on, and they're investing back home on orders of magnitude greater than we are, particularly at the central government level. Now, we're obviously not going to follow the model of the Chinese Communist Party, but how do you think about a shift in the way domestically we need to be thinking about industrial policy? It's almost anathema to a capitalist economy, but there are elements of that I think we're starting to see it bubble up where we have to have some sort of collaboration and partnership, not just between DC and Silicon Valley and everything in between, but other like-minded governments, particularly liberal democracies throughout the world. How are you thinking about some of those challenges that we're faced with?
Well, Chris, I think I just talked about it in terms of public-private partnerships. Look, the Chinese model doesn't work, in my view, and never has proven in human history to have state-owned enterprises work. And, there's not a long line of people wanting to go to China for a reason. And there is a fear of what they're doing. We look at the disappearance of Jack Ma, look at the collapse of some of the real estate. That said, we shouldn't underestimate just their size and their investment in terms of the competitive challenge. Now, our private sector investment dwarfs theirs in AI, but here's why we need government investment. The private sector is not going to have an incentive necessarily to have AI that's data free or using less data. There's a brilliant person at MIT, Josh Tenenbaum, who said he literally described it to me as he's engineering Immanuel Kant. And by that he meant, when you have a young person they don't need 5,000 pictures of a cat to know what the word cat is. It just so happens that the human mind has categories that allow us to comprehend that. So he's thinking, how do we have AI that's like human intelligence that won't need this much data? That may not be funding that a private sector has a interest in funding, but it should be something that the government funds. And that's the type of thing that the Innovation and Competition Act does. And the Innovation and Competition Act actually says, here are the 10 areas, semiconductor manufacturing, electronics manufacturing, quantum computing, that we need to invest in. And let's create those strategic investments, recognizing that the private sector then will play a key role in commercializing them. So whether you call it industrial policy or you call it public-private partnership, I think there's a greater move in recognizing that. One final point, and then I don't want to give too long-winded answers. I'm in the House, not the Senate, so I'm always mindful of that. But you know, the president can do a lot. One of the things I keep floating is this idea. Well, the president should say, by 2025, we want to have 1 million rural Americans in digital jobs and 1 million Black and Latino Americans in digital jobs. And he ought to convene the land-grant university presidents and some of the private college presidents, and he ought to convene the Tim Cooks and Satya Nadellas and some of the HBCUs. And I just think if you set out that kind of vision and you work on the convening of it, then a lot can get done. So not all of it is just policy. I mean, there's actually the power of setting goals and convening, and that's what Kennedy did with the moonshot.
Ro, this brings up an interesting point, because I've heard others say that the Biden administration, of course, is focused on some very important matters, and they have to get those things out of the way in the first year and a half. What has the reception been like, and at what level of the administration, to the ideas you've been presenting? Is it something they've embraced, or something that they, smile pleasantly at while you're discussing it, and then there's no follow-up?
No, Ron Klain gets this. I mean, Ron Klain worked for Steve Case, who's principally responsible for Rise of the Rest. And I give the president a lot of credit for running on the Innovation and Competition Act and having these investments. So I think they get it. I guess what I would say is that they probably need a broader story of America. In other words, think, Larry, if $20 billion had gone to Ohio under Donald Trump, every American would think that Donald Trump single-handedly was trying to revitalize the Midwest. And yet there are very few Americans who actually know about Intel going to Ohio. And somehow we have not told enough of the aspirational, hopeful, positive story. And that's the book is ultimately not, it's about tech, but it's about the hope for America's future and what does it mean. And I think tech is seen as an avenue to that. 70% of young people in my district are optimistic about America's future. And somehow I think the administration and we in Congress have to offer that kind of hopeful, aspirational, positive message of economic possibility in this country. And that's not breaking through. And so I think substantively they're there. I think in terms of telling a story of America, which is probably the most important thing a president can do, that's a challenging issue, and it's challenging in these times.
Unfortunately, I think the story that's been told has mainly been factional fighting, which has resulted in defeat for big pieces of the Biden program. Understanding, of course, when you've only got 50 senators, if you lose one, much less two, there's not a whole lot you can do about it. One thing I've learned in these book interviews is you never go more than a half hour without showing the cover. I should have done this right in the beginning, because we're here to make sure people read this terrific piece of work. Dignity in a Digital Age. I think I'm holding it correctly. Make sure that you get this either right now and you know where to go without my mentioning it and giving it more publicity, or your independent bookseller. And I'm a great fan of independent booksellers, so take a look there too.
Larry, how many books have you written?
Well, it depends on what you call a book. I'd say, technically 24, but that includes anthologies. And, a couple of them were, coloring books, because I wanted to get it out to people who don't read much. I'm kidding. I didn't do any coloring books, not yet. But it's been a long and fun career, and I've enjoyed it. I'm getting ready to turn 70, so many people are suggesting that I should be near retirement.
Oh, I don't believe that.
Yeah, well, they're not my
That's the
friend.
age where you just begin to start your ascent on Capitol Hill. That's a
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, well, we're electing freshmen now who are 70s. Maybe that's my future. But I'm in the 5th district of Virginia, so you can forget it as far as that's concerned.
Well, you never know. You never know.
Well, I'll have you in the campaign for me then if I run.
I'd be happy to.
That way I'll have a real chance. Look, we're going to get back to your book, but I would be remiss if I didn't ask you a couple of questions about critical matters before the Congress. Now, I know you're not on the January 6th committee. And maybe this just reveals my bias about how important this is. You talk to colleagues, they seem to be going well below the surface and reaching people with real information about potential crimes. What is your impression of what they're doing, understanding that if the current prognostications are correct, Democrats have the rest of this year and that's it to do the job? Are they far enough along? Will they have enough time for public hearings to make an impact? Because we all know, the front pages, we don't have front pages anymore, but if we did, they're very crowded. They're very crowded with lots of different matters. It's tough to get people to focus on things. What's your general impression of the January 6th committee and where they're heading?
Well, they're doing extraordinary work, and they have some extraordinary people on it, people of deep commitment and public service, and people who are aiding the committee. I mean, Benny Thompson is doing a fantastic job. Liz Cheney, who I disagree on so many foreign policy issues, is showing that she's a patriot. People like Adam Schiff and Jamie Raskin have been engaged. So I believe that they're going to lay out a clear roadmap of what happened, of who was responsible for inciting violence on our Capitol. And, really, this should not be a partisan issue. You've had the Capitol overrun in the United States. If you talk about being tough as Americans and not signaling weakness to our enemies, don't we want to make it very clear to everyone in this world that will never happen again, that no one should even dream of attacking American democracy at the Capitol, whether they're in the United States or outside? So I think the report will say where we failed, who was responsible, and refer some matters to the Justice Department. Then it's obviously up to the Attorney General of where to prosecute. I'm glad that you even had Lindsey Graham saying that the idea of pardoning people who engaged in violent insurrection was wrong, that there has to be an accountability. And I guess we just have to figure out a language that can make this not about Donald Trump or even partisanship, that this is really about the protection of American values. And if you're a true conservative, it should scare you that someone's trying to overturn the rule of law and overturn democratic society. That's a huge threat to everything from wealth to business to social norms in this country. And so I'm no doubt that they will do an extraordinary job. The question then is, how do we message that gets beyond the partisan filters, where people just assume that if you're for Trump, then the commission doesn't have value, and if you're critical of Trump, that it does.
Yeah, that's the fundamental problem here. It's just pure partisanship in a very partisan age. But it's incredible to me and really outrageous that more than a year after January 6th, the Senate minority leader, former majority leader, can say in a major announcement that this was a violent insurrection, which was patently obvious on the day it occurred. And it makes headlines because so many people apparently don't believe it was an insurrection, and some actually believe it wasn't violent. That was the FBI in there, Antifa, or whatever nutty things they're coming up with. I don't know whether you focused on this. I've been looking into it, and I have mixed feelings about it, though I would love to see it happen. The 14th Amendment, Section 3 of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, clearly does allow Chris is laughing. I know he's going to answer this, but that is a potential avenue. It seems to me, if you can't get the Justice Department to act in other ways, that maybe you can get some of these people, like a former president we could name, disqualified from running again. Is this a totally unreasonable interpretation of the 14th Amendment, Section 3, or not?
When you referenced my legal education in the introduction, Bruce Ackerman has sent me 3 emails on this theme saying you guys have to take this up. And he's one of the premier constitutional scholars of our time. I think it's worth looking at. I certainly would explore it. I think the question, though, is a question of raw votes. I mean, we had the opportunity to convict Trump, and McConnell flinched. And whether you would be able to get the amount of votes to disqualify him, I think is hard right now. Not because there aren't privately a lot of Republicans who would be fine with that, but because they fear the primaries in their own states, and they fear what Trump's capable of doing. Look at the sitting governor of Georgia, who's having a very credible challenge by someone who was defeated by Ossoff. I don't know the recent polling, but that seems like a horse race for the simple reason that Donald Trump endorsed. And so, if Barack Obama tomorrow were to endorse against me in my district, it would not be pleasant and it would not be great. And I certainly hope I would try to do everything to prevent it, but I wouldn't lose my seat over it. I mean, it wouldn't be there's still a lot of people that say, well, he shows up at town halls and he does constituent services, and we've known Roe for years. Whereas that's not the phenomena in the Republican Party. You literally have people 20, 30 years in a community. Donald Trump endorses against them, and that's it. And so that's what has to change.
Okay, Chris, come on into this.
There are so many things that I think we're kind of missing for the bigger picture when we think just about January 6th and the events on the Capitol. Larry, we've talked about how that was predictable. There were plenty of intelligence signals out there in social media groups and things like that. But ultimately, whatever happens with the Department of Justice investigations and prosecutions right now, they're focusing on the wrong end of the spectrum. Maybe not on the wrong end of the spectrum, but the legal action is going right now in the public sphere, at least, against the foot soldiers. And what I think is much more important to the preservation of democracy and the sanctity of elections going forward is that we have a greater accounting of the strategists, the people that were actually behind laying out the roadmap and putting the pieces in place across the various states, including the 7 states that submitted alternate slates of electors. 2 of those, or 5 of those rather, being absolutely fraudulent. So that is that. If the January 6th committee does any single thing, it's to lay out that comprehensive accounting of what was happening behind the scenes, who the key players were, and then putting that out for all the public to see, including through public hearings. Now, do I think that is going to end up in a bunch of different prosecutions? I don't know. Probably not. But I'm telling you, the American people don't like being conned. They don't like being, grifted upon. And there are market enforcement mechanisms that can come to bear here. I mean, look at what DirecTV did with OAN when it became clear what was happening there from a funding. They dropped them and they didn't renew the contract because the people that I personally canceled DirecTV because of their long-term support of OAN. So there are different mechanisms, there are different accountability norms that we need to pull on. And then ultimately, as an aside, by the way, the real opportunity was in the second impeachment hearing and on the Senate side to convict him and, put into play that mechanism that would, prevent the former president from running or holding further political office. I mean, that, Larry, we talked about that in another Center for Politics event, and that was it. They just didn't pull the trigger. And I think we're still, as a nation and frankly as democracies worldwide, are paying the price for the lack of incisive action a year ago.
Well, go ahead, Ro.
I agree with everything you said. In fact, I think partly there was a lack of urgency because people thought Trump was done after January 6th. I remember telling my wife that. I said, there's no way he recovers from this. And she said, don't be so sure. And obviously she's usually got the better instincts. But I think McConnell and others thought, okay, he's done. There's no way he's going to recover. And he's been underestimated time and again. But that was the decisive moment. And I agree with you. The strategists need to be exposed. The scary thing is that this wasn't just something in Donald Trump's brain. There were 30 people on PowerPoint presentations coordinating how they were going to systematically overturn the election by having false allegations of corruption, creating chaos, and throwing the election to the state legislatures. At the very least, if you expose people, there may be a disincentive for people to go along with that kind of a plan again. Otherwise, there's no disincentive for them to try this in 24, 28, or any future election.
Absolutely. I mean, one way to look at it is that was a practice run. And unless there is accountability, unless you impose costs on those that were involved, they're going to do it again. And they might actually be competent this time. And that's frankly what scares me the most.
Yeah, what really saved us, nobody ever mentions this, what really saved us is that Donald Trump actually thought he was going to win and therefore didn't spend 3.5 years plotting out how he was going to engineer this coup to steal a presidential term. We were very lucky that he was easily fooled by himself. But this next time, obviously, we wouldn't have that advantage and we wouldn't have a lot of other advantages. And I think everyone is legitimately worried about what's going to happen in 2024, especially given what may happen. Ro, I'm not saying it will happen, but what may happen in November, and potentially in both houses. And
well, we all
follow
Kyle's ratings. So we're
what's that?
We all follow your and Kyle's ratings.
Oh, okay, good. Well, there you go.
Hey, so Larry,
the correct ones are mine. The ones that are wrong, Kyle did them. Okay.
So I gotta point out though that in 2020, no offense, Congressman, but the House races and whatever cohort this is, cohort C or whatever, class C, that's honestly that's the second stage. For me, in terms of threats to elections, Secretary of State races in Georgia, Arizona, Michigan, Wisconsin, Nevada, and a handful of others, Colorado, though that's where the real action is going to be. And for 2024, what you could see is a partisan official in, a lot of those Secretary of State offices are, obviously party officials, but you could see a true believer, a true stop the steal believer that thought the 20 election was stolen, and they could be in a position to influence the conduct of an election and the certification. Maybe next time you don't have Brad Raffensperger in there actually, doing, holding up his obligation to his oath to the Constitution. You could have Jody Heiss in there. And it's not entirely clear to me that, in fact, it's probably trends the other way, that we'd get the same outcome.
Congressman, have you taken a look at all at the proposed revisions to the Electoral Count Act? And I wonder what you think of them as proposed. There are different versions of it, but something is emerging that I think will probably come to a vote. I would hope would come to a vote, but tell us what you think on that.
Well, I think Senator King and Klobuchar are doing a terrific job, and I think they have certainly the support of the Democratic caucus. I hope they'll get at least 10 Republicans, though that's not a sure thing. But as I understand the crux of the bill, what they're saying is every state currently has on its books a law that whoever wins the popular vote in that state, the legislature needs to have that the slate of delegates reflect the popular winner in that state. And that if you were to overturn that law in those states, that would trigger judicial review. And I believe, some people who are progressive and on the left may not agree with my saying this, but I believe even a conservative Supreme Court at this point, as conservative as the court is, would not go in a majority for allowing a blatant overturning of a state election if the state law said the popular vote winner gets it and the legislature tried to give it to someone else. And so the Electoral Count Act is not 100%, but it would go a long way to check the most nefarious situation, whereas Trump runs, loses Arizona 48-52, and still gets the slate of electors and gets a hypothetical Republican speaker to say, okay, that he's the president. And the House races matter for that reason. Look, I'm still obviously pushing, hoping that we keep the House. But even if you believe, and it's an uphill fight, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. I mean, every president in the party, their own party has a hard time. And we've had a challenge with COVID and inflation and the mood of the country. So everyone's realistic. But the goal is to win. But even if we fall short, there is an enormous difference to democracy, whether the Republicans win by 10 seats or whether they have 40 seats. And there's an enormous difference in what McCarthy or whoever speaker would do, whether that's impeaching Biden or what that would mean for the 24 election. So the House races matter, even if you don't believe me that we have a shot to keep the House.
Well, they also matter because of the crazy quilt provision in the amended Constitution about the House votes, state delegations having one vote each. Incredibly, California having the same vote as Wyoming for president if no one got to 270, and there was no way of dealing prior to that. That is a real nightmare, and it's existed for a long time. I mean, 1824, yeah, that's how they did it, but it didn't matter much in 1824. There was hardly a popular vote, tiny little popular vote. But we can't ever seem to work on legitimate reforms until we have a terrible crisis that results in an awful result. And that would be my suggestion, that somehow we could, I don't think, well,
That's
no,
human nature, Larry.
Yeah. Well, I know that we need to, that's what genetic engineering is for, Chris. So we need to get to the genetic engineering. Ro knows all about that too. Well, I hope you're right, Ro, because my bet on the Supreme Court would be another Bush v. Gore 5-4, with Roberts siding with the three more liberal justices. I'm sorry, they have become increasingly political and predictable. Not in every single case, but in the really political cases, yes. Look at Alabama.
Yeah, no, I mean, Alabama, if ever there was a case for the House using our own power, someone sent me this to end gerrymandering. It's what happened in Alabama, and just a total indifference to the voting rights of African Americans. So, maybe, I mean, I still have hope that they won't be as blatant in the total destruction of our democracy, and they didn't take up a lot of the cases in 2020. But you're right. I mean, that's not it's not comfort just to rely on the court. Though the Electoral Count Act is, absent a constitutional amendment, which is so hard to do, it seems to me the best safeguard that we could put right now towards keeping the sanctity of the 2024 election. And it's not a slam dunk. I mean, it would be great if we could have some Republicans come out and say, yes, we're for at least this.
Yeah, well,
for me, it's table stakes, right? I mean, it's fairly low barrier to entry and low friction. And in fact, you'd think the Republicans on the Hill would be interested in supporting it. For the trope you've heard laid out that the vice president could be the one opening those the envelopes from the states and the slate of electors, and just maybe she gets different legal guidance. So I think it's in everybody's best interest that we do the bare minimum of reforming the Electoral Count Act.
Well, one would hope so. Of course, traditions and customs and standards matter a lot too. Today in one of my classes, I showed the excerpt of election night 1960. Neither of you were living, so you can't contradict me. But in 1960, of course, it was an extremely close election. But Nixon, in the middle of the night, came out because he could see which way it was going, though actually it moved more toward his direction after he said this. But he came out and had his wife next to him and she was crying and so on, and nothing wrong with that. But it was the most gracious statement imaginable from Nixon. People don't remember that part of Richard Nixon. And he said it's extremely important in our country. We've always had a tradition of the loser at an election coming forthright behind the winner and joining together because we need to be unified. It was a beautiful little mini speech given under terribly difficult circumstances, and the crowd was arguing with him. It was his crowd. That's gone now because of Donald Trump. The test of a democracy is not accepting the results of an election you win. It's accepting the results of an election you lose. And I really wonder now whether we're going to have that, at least on one side of the political equation in the future, anytime it's close. If it's a big margin, that's something else again. Am I being too pessimistic, Ro?
I think you raise a very good point. Look, I've lost 2 elections before I won, and I lost to the same person I beat in my Khanna. And I remember after I lost the first time, it was 48-52. The ballots were being counted, and I like to think I was gracious, and it was easier for me than when I beat Mike Khanna, ended his career in 14 years. And he didn't take it that well, but he was gracious. He had, he had emails. He had the choice of whether to give emails for the constituency and transfer them to me or not. And he chose to do it because he wanted to have good constituent services. And there's a lot in a democracy, I believe, that it doesn't rest just on the rule of law. It rests on, as you put it, tradition, the inculcation of values in a citizenry, the vigilance of a citizenry. You can't make every single thing a legal matter and have a robust democracy. And that's what was so scary about Trump, is people say, well, can't you fix all the norms he defied? Yeah, we can try. We're trying to plug holes. But if you don't have a civic virtue of some kind, of a sense that we learned since 3rd grade, where you stand for a student election, and that's how we do things in America, or where we have charity drives, because that's who we are as a people. And if we start to lose that or erode that, that's really a tremendous erosion of democracy. And that's, I think, the real threat that Trump poses to the country.
And he's created a precedent for the very worst behavior. And undoubtedly, there will be another unscrupulous candidate who will use that precedent, cite that precedent. And it worries me a great deal. Chris, I know you were trying to say something.
Look, I mean, the last 4 years, the prior administration, the pervasive and systematic erosion of democratic norms here in the U.S. and our standing in relationships abroad was nothing short of I struggle sometimes putting words on these things because I don't feel like we have the appropriate set of tools available to describe just how shocking it was. But I think the bigger issue here is that this is why it's so important that everyone now, in moving forward, uphold the sanctity and integrity of elections, that we don't try to pre-bunk, or not pre-bunk, but call into question the results of future elections. I got to admit, I was a little disappointed with the president and the Senate Majority Leader when they call the legitimacy of the 2022 or 2024 if we don't pass this legislation or that legislation. I agree that voting rights legislation, the Electoral Count Act, the John Lewis Act, those are all critical pieces of legislation, but we cannot undermine the outcome of future elections going forward. So I think we got to be more careful about that. Good faith, Democrats have the high road right now. Use that relentlessly going forward if they want to win.
I think what I agree with you that we shouldn't be calling into question the actual legitimacy of the 22 or 24 elections, but there's the difference from ideals of what we can orient our politics towards, to have true legitimacy and saying an election is a legitimate practical outcome. We should say, yeah, of course it's a practical outcome. But the ideal of a democracy is everyone have an equal vote and equal voice, not distorted by the exclusion of people based on their race or their and obviously not distorted by huge sums of money. And I think what they're saying is, from a philosophical perspective, having elections where you have systematic disadvantages for Black voters, that's not moving towards a true multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy. Not that we're going to call into question the actual results on election day.
Which I, of course, all agree with. The one issue, as always, though, is nuance dies a very quick and painful death on Capitol Hill in front of the stick. So, we have to be I think we just have to be really disciplined in the way we talk about these things.
Well, that's a good way to conclude a tremendous conversation, which I've enjoyed enormously. And Congressman, I've got to apologize to you because we did get away from the subject of your book, but I think your comments on these other subjects impressed our audience, as they should have, because you have a wide range of expertise on the subjects that face Congress. And I wish I could say that of all members of Congress, but of course I can't. So let me just take the opportunity to encourage people one more time, if I can get this right, to purchase Congressman Ro Khanna's book, Dignity in a Digital Age. It is very much worth your time to read. It's, I'm sure, the first of many that you will have as a member of Congress. I hope it will be, because you can cover a wide range of subjects and educate the American public in a way that we all need. I want to thank you for joining us. You've got an incredibly busy schedule, Congressman, and I want to thank our good friend Chris Krebs and our guest scholar here at the Center for Politics for joining us as well. It's been a lot of fun, and we look forward, Congressman, to having you right here in Charlottesville once we get back to actually seeing people in person. I hope that's really you. I'd have no way of knowing, but knowing a little bit about you, I'm sure that it really is you. So thank you so much, Congressman. Thank you very much. Chris, thank you. And thanks to our audience for staying tuned. And we'll look forward to seeing you at our next event, which will be next week, the day after Valentine's Day, February 15th, when we'll be interviewing Jonathan Karl, the ABC News correspondent and author of several books about politics, two most recently about Trump. And the one that we'll be talking to him about is betrayal. And it relates directly to the subject that we've been discussing in the second half of the current interview. So good night to all of you, and to those from the University of Virginia, wahoo wah.